The pledge of
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Making a motion on the consent agenda.
I make a motion that we accept the consent agenda.
There a second
I'll second.
discussion. No discussion on the meeting minutes or the licensing. Let's take a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Recused? The motion carries.
Wait, what?
Do you have some minutes for me to sign, Rachel?
Oh, did that include the business?
I don't have them from the last
It did.
meeting, no, I can get them.
It did?
for
I think
you.
so.
I'm just jumping
Hold
in,
on.
so,
I'm supposed to recuse myself.
Like sign these.
are they in there?
Yeah,
Oh, then I do have them for you, I put them in there just for you.
my friend is out at my house and if you were there and I didn't know it.
Yeah, I didn't put this pocket together, so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot that the consent agenda includes the business licenses.
Yes, it does.
Should we redo that and I'll recuse myself?
We can, we had a quorum, we all voted aye.
I'll make a note of the meeting notes.
Cool.
Okay, new items of business, commission member reports, I have nothing. Brian,
I also have nothing.
Tom,
I'd like to bring something up. Just not an item for action. But something for thought. There's a property on Second and Augustus that I think
second and word.
Augustus. I think it could be a real asset to the city. But as it stands, it's a terrible liability.
Okay.
And I don't know if there's action that the city can take. But if there is action, I think we should look into what that might look like. It involves 2/3, I think, of it probably involves 3 lots.
Are we talking about the Quonset hut?
Yes, we are talking about,
Oh.
we are talking about the Quonset hut. And the adjacent property.
Used to be the old Cozy Theater.
Yes, it did at one time, and then there's the
Yeah,
vacant
antique store.
or the unused, totally unused property. Between that and the duplexes, and it just seems to me like. Where the city is right now. Looking at some growth. That could be just a super asset. Retail space, parking.
Sure.
It could be a huge asset to the city, and it's really nothing right now. It's a place where rodents and stray cats go. It's a place where ivy grows. It's a place where junk and garbage has been stored for years and years and years, decades, let's say. It's a total liability as it stands.
But you do know it is owned by the same guy that has the duplex.
Yes.
Great duplex.
Yes, I am aware of that, and I don't know what the process might be. But I think it might be worth pursuing.
Have you had conversations with Ben Councilman
I did with his father,
with regards to a purchase price?
not interested. He wasn't interested.
He's not interested in selling.
I'm not sure what the family is doing now. But be interesting to reach out to the family. I think the older sister is responsible for the properties or something like that.
They quoted me a price of 160,000.
I'm sorry?
Did they pay you to take it?
Hmm?
Did they pay?
No,
Take it?
no.
It's gonna cost $100,000 to empty it.
At least it would be very costly.
Structural cracks
Yeah.
down the side.
Yeah. That guy.
Yeah, I always wonder if something's gonna break off and hit someone as they walk under it.
And that building is a 0 lot line. around it.
So is that something we have in our code enforcement that could be used to deal with that?
The nuisance code probably falls under that. The buzzard, our attorney was talking to us about things like that, and it sounded like that was practically an example.
Staff?
So we can, if you want to email me the parcel, or I can get that, I can look at what the zoning is and what it allows, what the required setbacks are. And see if it looks like it's in compliance with your zoning code, and if it's not, then you can certainly start a code enforcement action to force them to come into compliance.
Well, they're not grandfathered in?
Well, they may be if they existed prior to the adoption of your zoning code.
I believe they.
I believe they do.
Yeah. This is a 1930s, 40s building.
But any modifications they've done or any additions.
Doesn't
that
look
they
like
made-
they've touched that thing in years.
Okay, well, and that, I mean, if everything's there and it's been there prior to zoning code, then they're probably allowed to at least continue the use as it exists. But they wouldn't be allowed to modify or expand the use at all. If they do that, that would be a violation, or if they have done that since your zoning code was adopted, that would be a zoning code violation. As the councilman said, you also have nuisance codes that say that regardless of what you're allowed to do in zoning, if it stinks or smells bad or sounds too loud to your neighbors, oftentimes communities have nuisance codes, and those are outside of land use.
Is there any kind of like safety code?
There are,
Because I think there's some real concerns that.
so your building official could take a look at it. I mean, if it's not structurally sound and it's not inhabitable, then they can effectively condemn the structure.
Okay,
So, or regardless of zoning, if it wasn't ever constructed with the idea that it was meant to be habitable, like, you know, I mean, some of the Quonset huts weren't really made to be something you live in. Or, you know, but if it's a danger to public health and safety, then your building official can look at the state building codes. And there's no other way to go about it that way.
I think it was always commercial. I don't think it was ever
Commercial
residential.
occupancies are tougher than residential occupancies even still. Well, I guess not so in all, offices are less, but a lot of commercial because the number of people that could gather in there. The only thing that puts residential higher is the fact that you sleep in it. So it has a little bit of a difference in building code, but commercial building codes aren't easy either.
Why don't we do this, Tom, since you brought it up? Do you want to do a deep dive into our codes
I'll take a look.
and see what you can find?
Sure.
And I'd be happy to guide you
Please do.
if you need a little help and.
Yeah, I would certainly welcome
Have
your
my
guidance.
email, we can correspond and I can help.
Okay, good. Thank you, Todd.
Sure.
Anything else?
That's, yeah.
Daniel? Okay, let's move on to new business. Number one on the agenda is discussion with the Lewis County UGA permit process. And I believe this stems from well, is this regarding expanding our UGA or is it?
No, this is actually the interlocal agreement, for the UGA.
Okay,
I know we have it parallel with the discussion of the annexation request, but it's not really. I don't know if we have the zoning map? I've got one here on my iPad, but.
I have it in my memory.
And this did come about, because prior to requesting annexation. The parties contacted the city and asked about zoning and development. And kind of much to everybody's surprise, the city of Toledo is one of the few that doesn't have an agreement or a recognized zoning plan by the county.
right.
There are, the county controls everything outside the city. The city has control of everything inside the city limits, that's their jurisdictional boundary. And the only thing that may extend outside of the city limits are water and sewer services, but you really don't have any legislative control over that, other than that you control the water and sewer because they're yours. So in a GMA planning county, you have an urban growth area. The urban growth area surrounds the city limits, and those identify areas that both the city and the county recognize as being future growth. We just saw that when we just processed the big annexation of all the property. That property then came into the city or will come into the city as soon as the boundary review board completes their process. And then you will have jurisdiction over it. You'll have complete jurisdiction in the city limits.
But the question about what happens to the areas outside the city, a lot of counties will just downzone those, make them ag zones or something that don't allow any development. The idea is that it's preserved for the future when the city wants to expand. They don't want to expand in the property that isn't going to meet an urban need, right? So if you allow the parcelization of property or the subdivision of property outside city limits, into some small chunks, then what's the purpose of ever annexing that property? Because it's never going to achieve a higher density. The residents on there aren't likely to convert. So what counties do is oftentimes they'll put a zoning halo around it, but in Lewis County, they kind of have a unique approach. The city also has a comprehensive plan. You have a future land use map where you've identified zoning for areas outside the city. And they're city zones, residential or commercial or whatnot. So what Lewis County has done is, because many of the cities in the county have done that, and they've done the future land use maps and they've identified future city zoning, is they've said that they can recognize the city zoning out there, but they'd still process the permits for the land use actions. Or the county gives another option in that through an interlocal agreement, they will not only recognize the zoning, but they'll defer the permit processing for anything that comes in to the city. And so they have three different tiers. One, they don't recognize anything, which is where we are now. So they just basically have a holding zone over everything, so nothing can happen. The second option is just that they recognize your plan and they'll apply your planning standards, but they'll process the permits. And the third option is through the interlocal agreement, that they would actually allow you to process the permit applications in there. And effectively give the city jurisdiction over land use. You still don't have complete jurisdiction. You don't have policing authority or anything else outside city limits. But the interlocal agreement allows you land use control.
So that's, if I'm not correct, mistaken, that's what Winlock has done with most of their development there. Most of their development still sits, at least it did until the BRV review board made their decision the other day in UGA area. But their argument was we were able to get all the water hookups, all the sewer hookups, and because we process our own permits, we got the building permit fees as well. And the only drawback was that without the annexation, and I believe there's a covenant and all those developments that state that they will annex at the time the city requires.
Well, that's not something that every jurisdiction has done. It's certainly a tool. Because what you don't want to have happen is have a bunch of urban development that happens in your UGA and then nobody wants to annex. They don't want to be a part of the city. They already have all the urban services they need, and they have everything they want. So oftentimes in other jurisdictions, there's a hook, as part of approving a development, or some communities do it through water and sewer hookups. Basically what happens is you require the property owner to sign an agreement that runs with the land. It gets recorded and becomes binding on the land saying, we agree to annex. And because we've been given these things and allowed to do this in exchange for that, we're agreeing to annex at any time that the city sees fit. And what that does then is it makes it able for properties to develop outside of your city limits to an urban density, but where they're either not able to annex for one reason or another, or where they don't have the land mass to be able to fund an annexation effort, they can still develop to an urban density, sign a covenant that says, yeah, when the city wants, we'll annex. And then at the next go around, when you have an annexation application, you can pull them in too. Or you can wait until there's a critical mass in that area or anything you want. We had talked about some areas of town where there's little donut holes. This would allow those donut holes all to develop. Looking at some of the areas, we've just annexed all of this over in here and some of this over in here, which that's pending in front of the BRB. I think this is the area that we had talked about down here about how do we clean that up and get them to come in. Well, if they've already got water and sewer services, that's not a hook anymore, but maybe allowing them to develop to urban density and having the city process the permits with an agreement to annex at a time the city wants, that might bring them in at some point. So it has its benefits to have the interlocal agreement, or at least have the county, it doesn't really have as much benefit to have the county recognize your zoning. Because then they're approving the permits and you can't condition them on annexation.
Right,
So the middle option is kind of the worst. It's the worst for the property owners and it's the worst for the city. The first option is absolutely the worst for the property owner should they want to develop. And the last option with the ILA addresses the city's needs and addresses an applicant's needs, and it allows you to condition through development application or water and sewer connections.
but something I didn't know, and I'm not sure anyone else did either, is if we were to form an ILA with the county on the third option, that would encompass all of the rest of our UGA as well,
Yes, and future UGA.
and future UGA.
You
So
ever
that,
had a UGA expansion, as long as the interlocal agreement didn't expire or was somehow other invalidated. It would continue to apply in the future, so you immediately, as soon as you expanded your urban growth boundary, you'd achieve land use control over those areas.
right, okay, now the I think we were taking for a moment, listening to the council meeting. Taking the aspect of looking at that individual parcel and going, they're an island in of themselves surrounded by other land, how are they ever gonna gain access? Or,
Well, I think that was specific to the annexation proposal that's before us. And we can talk about it now, or we can talk about it more when we get to that agenda item. But this certainly does apply in that case. In that case, they're creating an island of unincorporated area surrounded by the city. And that goes against the GMA planning policies. So it's not likely to be, there are several geometries. Well, even when we did the last annexation, the county DRB or the county gave us early notice that excluding that little square, that little parcel
right,
would cause an irregular boundary because of the road.
right,
And they didn't think that parcel would ever come in. They said, well, every place across the way is likely to annex. But that parcel by itself is never really gonna come in by itself. They won't be able to sustain the burden of the annexation process. And they said, well, that's likely to cause us to invoke jurisdiction and take a closer look at your annexation. So that's why we amended the boundary to include that piece, because with the others, we could force them to come in. Even though they didn't sign on, they weren't opposed to it necessarily, they just didn't sign. So the 60% petition method, you only have to have 60, and we were able to include them and bring them in. So
I guess the point I was trying to make on that is. If we were to enter into an ILA, the surrounding parcels would also become part of that UGA that's dictated by the ILA. And then from a development standpoint, access, easement, and all of that would take place at development.
yes, right. The access, physical access to the property, how do you get to it? How do you supply it with water and sewer? How do you get in and out? Can you get a public road to it? That all happens at the time of development. At annexation, it's something that we think about on a big scale, but it's really, do we have the capacities for it? Do we have the ability for it? We don't really care if an applicant believes they can develop their property. If they come in and they want to annex, they say, hey, I want to annex because I want to develop my property. We just look at whether the city services can support that as part of the annexation. Because during the development review process, once they're in the city or when they apply for any development, they're gonna have to demonstrate that they can gain access and all those other things. But bringing them into the city immediately includes them in the city's jurisdiction, and provides that tax revenue and gives you legislative control over the property too. So annexation and development are two different pieces, although annexation allows development. Annexation doesn't permit development. You still have to go through a whole other development process that you have to demonstrate, yeah, we've got access, we've got pedestrian safety. And if there are issues that come up during development, like, hey, we don't have appropriate policing services, then you can condition the development on providing mitigation for their impacts. So, but that happens with development, not necessarily at annexation. So there's two different phases of development. But the question before you on this first agenda item is, should the city explore an interlocal agreement with Lewis County to gain permitting control over that area? Or should the city explore asking Lewis County to adopt by reference the city's future land use map, so at least they're applying city zoning? Or do we just not want to do anything and just leave it as it is, where the county is just going to apply the county holding zone zoning is not allowed?
Well, we run the risk if we don't do something of having the county allow development within their standards. In areas where we may have future uses that don't align.
So I was
That's
thinking of it,
Of the three options you listed, why would we not use the third?
yeah, good question.
Well, so using the third does permit, because if you have that interlocal agreement. And somebody comes to you with a development application that meets your standards, but yet is not annexed. They would be able to develop to that urban level of use outside of the city limits. The only downside to that I could see is that if you didn't have some sort of a covenant that ran with the land that was enforceable, that made them annex at a time when the city wanted it, then they would develop that intensity and you'd never see the tax benefits of that. They effectively develop to an urban level, and because they're adjacent to your city, they use the resources of that, but you wouldn't get the tax benefit of that until you annex.
That would happen under the third option.
Under the third option or the second option.
But it sounds beholding upon us then to ensure that anytime we
Approve a development.
approve a development, that hook is applied.
Right, and you'd only be able to do that under the third option. So
Right.
The second option, the county would just apply your zoning and they'd issue the permits and there would be no hook.
Right, that's why we would stay away from number two, because then the county would issue the permits.
And
And
as
we'd
long
be
as the
in-
development complied with county regs, then they'd have to approve it. You can't
Right.
deny it if it, land use applications are quasi judicial. So if somebody comes in and meets all the standards and they can show conclusively, we've met all the standards, and you have to approve it. You can condition them to mitigate further impacts, but you can't deny an application just because you don't want it to happen. Once it's allowed by your laws, then it's allowed. So-
And it's likely that a space outside of the UGA wouldn't develop to urban intensity because they don't have infrastructure attached to them, right?
That's true for a lot of those areas, but there are some, like the annexation area that you're going to hear later on the agenda tonight.
Yeah.
That is fairly proximal to city services and
Sure.
city water utilities.
I mean, a lot of those properties up north that are in the UGA but are not part of the annex are off of plowing downs.
Right, and they still have an extension for water and sewer to go.
And they have-
although with the planned infrastructure for that, the loop systems and such, those two will soon be close to water and sewer. Closer. So
So I think you're fighting the mindset of, I don't want to be part of the city. But I can't tell you why.
well, and so that doesn't make anybody any more a part of the city until they ask for a development application. So for
Right.
those people that are in your UGA that have no plans to develop and they don't want to be in the city. Then they can continue to exist as they are, and this ILA really doesn't affect them at all. Other than the fact that if they want to put up a new shed, they need a building permit, instead of going to the county, they come to the city, because you'd have jurisdiction over permits. So that's the difference to a property owner, that there's no other regulatory, they don't get taxed any differently, that none of that happens with the ILA. They're in the UGA already, or not. If the city chooses to expand their UGA, then the number of property owners impacted grows. For right now, it'll just impact people within the UGA that's designated on that zoning map.
Right.
And it gives you more land use control over what happens with those parcels. Is all the ILA does. Either option 2 or 3 gives you a little bit more, option 3 gives you more because you get to review and approve them.
Your thoughts?
Very interesting and insightful. I didn't think about this until like now.
Me neither.
And I didn't prepare a staff report on it. I mean, really, we're just kind of looking for some direction or questions.
Sure.
If you do get a notion of firm direction tonight, then you can give staff direction to take this to council with a recommendation. But I didn't really prepare a staff report. Council will have a public hearing on it. It's got to go through a public process before it, before it gets adopted. We've got to negotiate with the county before the ILA can happen too, and see if they're willing to do that. And we don't know that yet. So we have a lot of steps to go. So really, this is just kind of a work session to get some direction from you all on how you feel about it, or if you have more questions that can be answered.
I just can't, I can't see why we would even think about the first or second option. What would be the advantage?
Well, status quo, right? I mean,
Yeah, well, that hasn't worked.
has this ever been an issue for the city in the past? Is there a reason to change? That's the reason to maintain status quo, right? I mean, so far, the current system seems to have worked for you all. I mean, you haven't had control, and effectively what the county's done historically is they downzone the property. They put a holding zone over your UGA that says you can't develop it. I mean, you're allowed to develop to, for instance, like a 5 or 20 acre. It's a residential or a farm standard or something. It's an ag zone standard that they've applied to it.
Okay,
And,
okay.
and we haven't had growth either.
We haven't had growth.
And I gotta say that the egg zone that you just mentioned is something I'd like to see stay in place
Under the ILA,
myself.
it would change because then the future land use map, I don't think we have that up there. I didn't think to bring that, so that may be a good question to bring back, is how does it change? But I do have,
You have the GIS.
do you have the future land use map in GIS?
Are we done with this one?
I just had it. Can I, if I can ask this screen?
No. Yeah.
So it sounds like option one would slow the expansion outside the city.
Well, this is the UGA though, so it's our next development area.
Okay, so this only applies within the UGAs.
Right,
Okay.
but I can't see even thinking about doing number 2,
No,
because that's giving the county a guillotine over our head.
yeah.
Number 1, if you want to let the county continue to
That's.
dictate what development goes on out there, and I'm not sure with the growth and annexation that we're doing right now, close to that we want them to have that power.
I think we would rather have power.
So would I.
So that leaves option 3.
Yeah, so it's that's basically the only option, but then again, we just started hearing about it, though. So like, you said if somebody gets someone wants to do a shed permit, then it would go through the city, but they wouldn't be a part of the city and we wouldn't see the taxation, but we would be doing the services.
We see the permit fee.
Issuing the permit fee.
You'll see the permit fees,
Okay.
but you can also tailor the ILA. So I mean, if you wanted to, you could be specific and say, we don't want to do building permits, we only want to do subdivisions and development permits of a certain level, and it just depends on whether the county would accept that. I mean, typically for the county, it's easier if they just do an all or nothing. So that way it's clear who's processing land use permits, but not just the shed. I mean, if somebody bought a parcel and wanted to put up a new house, then who does the building permit application? Well, right now, the county does them all. The
Right.
city has plans to internalize that, do their own permitting for within the city limits. If we did the ILA with the county, we could include building permits in there as part of the ILA, and then you'd process all permits.
If we started the process with an ILA and took it to council as a recommendation that we choose option 3. What kind of a timetable are we talking about before we'd actually get an ILA?
Well, it's part of the thing that your city attorney would have to draft. We'd have to, so staff would then just approach the county. I think the county would be willing. I've had some initial conversations with their planning director and not get opposition, I guess is the safest way to say it.
Okay.
Without presenting anything, she certainly is not gonna commit to anything, but they've done it in other jurisdictions and they do allow it. So I don't see any hurdles at the county, and then what has to happen is it has to go, so first your recommendation would go to council. Council would then direct staff to begin the process. We formally start working with the county to draft an ILA. I'm guessing, 3 to 4 months.
As opposed to how long for an annexation?
Annexations, the
Yeah.
BRB is at least 45 days at the tail end. As we're finding out now, the submittal of a BRB doesn't start our 45 days. We have to wait for staff to give us a completeness review, which takes 3 to 4 weeks. So that alone is 2 months, and then we've got the actual process that you go through. You have to have at least 2 planning commission meetings and at least 1 council meeting. So, I mean, you've got.
At least another couple months,
So, and then you've got the public, you've got
public
CEQA,
hearing.
public noticing for both. So you've got, it's probably at least an 8 to 10 month process at minimum. You know, we tried to do the last one really fast and.
It didn't work.
Well, and the applicant too. I mean, the applicant has to meet the requirements and demonstrate they've met those, so you're waiting for the applicants to respond. On a simple one, on a 1 or 2 parcel one, I don't think it's gonna take as long as the other. Because that was a little bit complicated and they had multiple parcels, with multiple owners and different uses, commercial and residential. So they had a lot of complicated elements and a lot of moving parts that took longer. Now we've got one under our belt, so we can move faster and get it done more efficiently, I think, and also if you've only got a single applicant, it's easier.
If we requested the ILA for option 3, would we need a public hearing by either commission or council?
Eventually, yeah, I mean, at this point, you don't, we're having a workshop and you'll make a recommendation to council that this is what they should do. But then there will be public hearings at both county council and city council for the adoption of the ILA. And the property owners will likely get noticed by mail specifically and it'll be posted in the paper and it'll be a normal public hearing process.
Not that email, do not hear.
So Todd, all of the east side of Promenade would receive notice that they're under eviction.
They would receive notice of the hearing. That said that we were considering entering into an interlocal agreement for a change in the management of the permitting within that particular area. So they would definitely be noticed. Everybody in your UGA would get a notice.
And when they call Eric and ask him what the heck's going on, what will he be able to tell them? That there's really no changes, right? Unless you want to
Pretty
set,
adamant about not being in the city up
Do-
there. And a lot of them down on the tip of town, same thing. So it'll be a Winlock style.
unless you want it developed or not affected.
Well, and that's the truth of the matter. I mean, unless you apply for a permit, nothing changes and the jurisdiction doesn't change.
Yeah,
The city doesn't become, you're not in the city, you're not regulated by the city. But the permits are, and that's the true answer to the story is. Unless you want to develop or build something, and then if, like I said, you could tailor that. So you could limit it to subdivisions, or you could limit it to some other thing where the city was allowed to process permits, so the county would still process building permits if you wanted to. Just depends on, after you get to a point, the county, it gets too confusing for county staff and they're not interested in participating either, and then they wouldn't sign the ILA, so. But we don't know what that is, we haven't talked to them formally about it.
my thoughts are that leaning towards option 3 but how we tailor the ILA is.
I think that's a council and staff issue. And our attorneys.
And also, we just heard about this. I'm seeing the benefit of having that control and not
I am
having
too.
county. And I actually also see the benefit for the citizens to have that,
Yeah.
It has to go to your
I do too.
tax rate.
so.
So what do you think?
Sounds like we should feed that.
Three?
That's
Three?
what I just can't see any reason not to.
And we can even.
Would you want to make a motion to move forward with an ILA to council
Yeah,
under option 3?
option 3, we're gonna work on how we cut up that ILA so it really favors us the best way and favors the people that are into it.
Okay.
And he's right, Eric's right, there's gonna be public perception that they're getting their rights taken away from them, right? We're trying to give them more rights. So,
And make their land more valuable.
yes, sir. So,
Oh, there is. It is.
I agree.
yeah,
100%.
I think we're ready for a motion.
Okay,
That's.
and a motion is one option if you want to, like I said, if you want to
Make
get
a
more
recommendation.
information on this, you can, but if you want to make a recommendation, you can.
I'm ready for a motion.
you want me to say what we just said?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll make a motion that we recommend to council that we are leaning towards option 3 with clarification that we want to see how we can tailor the ILA specifically. So like you said, we can draft it up that way.
And are there specifics that you're interested in tailoring the ILA that will help council and staff know what the direction is?
How would you word that? I mean, yes, or like,
Well, I think it would, I'm not sure, I think it would come at annexation, or it would come at development where you'd have the hook. That would require annexation. I think if we just make a motion that they. Pursue an ILA with a county under option 3,
that's good enough, yeah.
that we're okay with that.
And the planning commission could request that council send that back before adoption, before the ILA becomes finalized.
There you go.
So before council does their final hearings on it, you could ask that, so you're making a recommendation that they pursue option 3 in the ILA, but. You're asking that they send it back to you for further guidance once the ILA is fairly finalized.
Yeah. And we all do a little bit of homework on how we can tailor that ILA.
So we need to do some wordsmithing.
Well, so that way, so by the time the ILA gets kind of vague, the county will have already had some input into it, as well as both their attorneys and the city attorney. So it'll come back to you and you'll be able to tweak the substance of it, but the framework of it will kind of be set.
Good.
I mean, once that happens.
Good,
Good,
great.
Do I get a second?
Second.
More discussion?
Did I just offer a friendly amendment to your motion?
That's perfect. That helped.
He answered the question too. That's good.
Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Excellent.
Mr. Grove, is that what you wanted to hear?
Need that happen.
I know, and you sent the other one.
Oh, I sent the wrong one.
Okay, item. Did we sort of cover item 2?
We have not yet.
Okay. Sort of sounds like we just did.
Well, and this is why I want to make sure that these stay separate in your minds.
Okay.
Before you, this item number 2. Even though it's on the agenda as a /ILA, that applicant had expressed some interest in the ILA. As an option for them, but that, I had been thinking about that anyway, with the previous request, so I mean, this was something that was already kind of coming up and. Maybe this annexation request forced the timing of the issue, but do we have the annexation map? It's in the packet, it's in your packet if you've got that. I did see that somewhere.
I don't see it.
Okay. Well, I can, maybe if you bring up the GIS for that area, I can illustrate the pieces.
One more thing down. This is the parcel down here.
Down where?
It's this.
Okay, so. So the applicants have filed a request for annexation. And they've requested that the city annex this property here. That kind of bell-shaped property. But in doing that. These 2 parcels inside. Would then be, if that were annexed, that would create an island of unincorporated area inside. So creating that island of unincorporated area, for one, it kind of goes against GMA planning policies, and you're a GMA planning city and you're required to follow those policies. Some jurisdictions will go ahead and do it anyway, just because they want the property in, and if it's a viable development, it increases their tax base. Ultimately, the county BRB gets to weigh in on it and approve an annexation as they are now with ours. So there's a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that nothing that violates GMA planning policies occurs. The reason the GMA planning policies exist that way is because it gets difficult for urban services. The city has a police staff, and you provide policing inside city limits. The county polices inside the county. Here, if that annexation were to take place, and this is just one of different examples, but you know, the county would then have to drive through the city to get to the county, and that provides it's a challenge for police to do that, because if they were to observe a crime as they were driving through the city and you don't have an agreement with the county to allow them to do policing inside city limits, then it becomes a problem. So police is just one example. You have a lot of services that the city provides, but the idea of creating that outside the city that's surrounded by the city becomes an issue for a lot of different planning reasons, and it makes those annexations hard to get approved. It doesn't mean that the city could not approve an annexation that did that. It just may mean that the BRB takes it back and says, we can't approve of this unless you eliminate the islands. An irregular boundary is one of the reasons that the BRB can invoke their own jurisdiction. So we might go through all of our effort and just have it go to the county and have it get rejected. And that's really in no one's interest.
But that's the cost of the city that.
Well, it's a cost of both the applicant and the city. I mean, the applicants pay the burden of all the consultant time to process that, and you know, it'd be me and Mike Johnson again. And then, you know, likely a little bit of other
Adam and the rest.
I mean, it's kind of the same team that we had before on a much smaller scale. But all of those elements you still have to consider when you're considering an annexation, and you have to make findings in order to support that process. So the applicant has requested this annexation. And you know, before we start setting the hearings for the 10% annexation and all that stuff and going through the council, I believe council wanted to get some initial input, because council became aware that the application was submitted, and they wanted to get some early input from planning commission on, you know, some strategies for this, and then have some discussion about, is this a path that the city wants to go down? I mean, the city may just choose to reject the 10% request because of this, or the applicant could withdraw it.
I could see them rejecting it as soon as they see that's an island.
Right.
I mean, if BRB was that particular with regards to the one lot up there on the annexation process, I can only imagine what their thoughts are gonna be on annexing an island.
And to be fair, that wasn't actually the BRB that gave us the input to begin with. That was the county staff who worked with their BRB that said,
Right.
this is likely to create an irregular boundary. So when
They gave you a heads up.
yeah, they gave us a heads up, but just like you all are the planning commission, you know, and I work with you all, I oftentimes get a tenor for what you're, you know, for what direction you go on things, and I'll oftentimes tell applicants, well, these are sometimes the concerns of the planning commission. So that's what they did for us in that case. But in this case, you know, you don't know until you try, but it's almost, the deck is kind of stacked against the annexation request in that it does create the island. I don't know if there's anybody that knows those property owners that wants to know if they want to annex, or if they would ever want to annex. I mean, certainly if they signed on, this would definitely be an approvable annexation. They're in proximity to city services. They check almost all the boxes for approval, except that this parcel specifically creates that odd island. You know, we've also kind of taken a quick look at the assessed valuation, because if you have at least 60%, then you can force people to annex, but you know, it's not really been the city's preference to try and do that. I mean, even with that little square, we took great caution to make sure we weren't really forcing somebody to propose. So that is the discussion for tonight, and I think what council was looking for was just some input from you all, and I believe the applicant is here. Is that? No. Yeah, it's not here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought maybe the applicant would be here tonight, but
Well, I feel good about moving forward with the ILA, which will give them some leeway. I don't feel good about annexing or spending the time and money trying to annex an island with no indication from the surrounding property owners that they're indeed on board with all this.
Okay, so I guess then the recommendation would be to council to not accept the 10% petition for annexation is really what you're.
You guys,
Who submitted the 10%?
It was submitted and signed by. Why I can't find this information here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but seems like something that should have happened a long time ago and didn't.
The annexation,
That they should have been a part of the city all along.
There's been no desire. The family is down there and doesn't have any desire.
But now they do.
well, a lot of that is farm field,
One out of how many?
3 or 4.
3 or 4.
One out of 5.
So a 10% petition wouldn't go if they were asking for annexation.
well, they've submitted with 100% now, they're just the property owner asking, but to force in the donut hole. They may have 10%, but they wouldn't have the 60.
Right, right.
This is a situation.
What's that?
I said, this is a situation.
Well, I think if I was a property owner, the thing I'd be hoping would be that. If there was an ILA that was struck with a county. And now the other property owners discovered that they might be able to subdivide and develop as well, whether they want to or not. They might more readily entertain annexation. Than as it sits right now. But right now they have no rights.
And poor services. Dangerously so.
I wouldn't have to rely on the sheriff's office showing up.
Nor would I. At all. And they're not here to tell us why they don't want to.
I wish they were.
Well, the name that I have associated with is Willie Grove.
Yeah,
Now, I looked at the property owner's name is actually somebody else.
It's also Devin.
It's
Jacobson.
Jacobson.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I think Devin's the one that signed the application form and she and Willie are the ones that.
On the county parcel map, it shows her as the sole owner.
Yeah,
Well, we know the family involved.
What's that?
We know the family involved in it.
We do, and pretending we're not. We're trying to look at this objectively.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
and you have to be objective.
Okay,
You have to consider the planning and land use policies. You can't consider the applicants.
yeah, okay.
That's,
Is it inappropriate to reach out to her and ask what's going on with this?
well, I've had a few conversations with Devin and I know that, she was hopeful that the city would pick up the ILA. My last conversation with her, she was saying, well, you know, that she even saw that this may not be approvable. She knows the zoning and
Right.
and land use codes, and she said, well, if this isn't approvable, then I'll just withdraw the application. And I said, well, let's wait until after the planning commission. So, you know, kind of given your motion to forward on the ILA concept, she's likely, I believe, to withdraw the application for annexation, just wait and see what happens, but I don't know.
Why wouldn't we, Todd?
Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't we? Suggest that we proceed with the ILA.
No, I mean,
Why
the
would
ILA
we
is a
not?
good idea. I'm fully supportive of that, but of course, it's all up to you. I'm trying to provide the best.
Well,
information.
yeah, and I'm just trying to think, why would we not?
Even when I'm supportive of a concept, I try to weed out all the other ideas
Yeah,
too,
right.
to make sure that I'm looking at everything objectively, but.
We appreciate that.
But on this annexation, that too, I mean, I think I've tried a few different things with, in my conversations with Devin. I haven't talked to Willie at all, but I've talked to Devin a few times and Devin, I've tried to get creative and say, well, you know, could you try this and that? But from what I gather, the adjoining property owners, for whatever reason, they just aren't willing to annex at this time. So they're not likely to sign a petition and they're not likely to be willing participants in an annexation process. So her really only hope, if she wants to develop, is to
I don't know.
is to annex,
Sounds like-
or
no,
if
it's
the
not
city
this.
does an
I
ILA.
think it's
develops, which may inspire the neighbors then to
The
develop
cooperative.
an annex,
Well,
right?
but if we had the ILA, we could put restrictions on what happens.
If you had the ILA, then you'd have to approve it for your zoning, but you can put extra requirements that says. For the covenant to annex you, because you're allowing them to develop to an urban density that's permitted inside the city.
Mhm.
Then the covenant would run with the land. A lot of cities do that with the utilities too, so you might do it both places, you might put it on the development itself and then require it when they connect new utility services.
Unfortunately, that brings up the question in my mind is, let's say you get the ILA. And you put the hook on their development that they annex to the city. And for the next 40 years, the other family members refuse to annex. And you've got an ongoing development out there in the middle of nowhere.
Well, you'll have a housing development that occurs on the fringe of your city that doesn't pay city taxes, but gets city services. But not city policing services, but other, the utility services and. So that is the downside of the ILA is that people never annex. If you do the ILA, people can develop and you have to approve them if they meet your standards. You can put the hook on them that says that they wouldn't oppose annexation, so the city at any time could just sponsor. You can sponsor an annex, the city can administratively start an annexation process. So if you have a number of those people that have signed covenants. And you said, we're tired of you not paying city taxes, we're gonna annex you all, then you could start that process. It wouldn't take a petition. Somebody doesn't have to petition. It's a different annexation method.
Oh,
Council member?
I have a question. Have you spoken about access to that lot?
Not at all, because we're not talking about development.
Okay.
So,
I'm just curious how that works in this. Okay.
I mean, it could be that if the annexation were approved and they came up with a development application, they couldn't demonstrate adequate access, and we'd have to deny it. Or the county would have to deny it. I mean, it's not approvable unless they can have access to a public.
I guess, the next question that brings to mind is can you force development prior to annexation?
Well, just like what we did.
Or
for the
force
annexation.
annexation prior to development?
Well, yes, and that's where you are now.
Well, what I'm saying
Status
is
quo is
I don't
that-
want them to have the capability to go out and build a subdivision. And then remain that way for 40 years. But the caveat would be that. We're not going to approve your development until you annex.
Well, you could do that too, but then you'd be in the same situation that you are now, and that you'd have an annexation that you can't approve. Or that you could approve, but may not make it through the BRB.
Right,
But the idea is that they're not opposed to it. So at some time in the future, when it becomes less of an island for whatever reason, then you could go out and annex it. But if you're allowing them to develop today with the idea that you can annex them whenever it becomes feasible to annex. So that may be the downside of the ILA, or either option 2 or 3 in that case. Is that you would allow them to develop and you'd have to. I mean, if you entered into an interlocal agreement that said, we're going to apply city zoning on these and we're going to process the permits, and if they come in with a permit application. You have to approve it. You can put hooks in there for mitigation, so you can say things like, because we're allowing you to develop to an urban density, you're gonna have to record a covenant that says you won't oppose annexation. You could do the same with your utility services, saying if you're gonna accept a new water or sewer connection from the city, then you're not gonna oppose annexation. So then you could build critical mass that way, but in this case, you would have no more ability to annex that property than a petitioning applicant would.
right,
So you can't create the donut hole either.
right.
So even though they have a covenant on the property, it may exist for however long that donut hole exists. You'd still see you wouldn't get the property tax benefits from it, but you would get the permitting revenues from
And the
it.
hookup fee,
And the hookup fees and the water and sewer.
if they could get an easement to get those.
And they pay more for water and sewer. People outside of your city limits pay more for water and sewer services. So, I mean, all of those benefits the city would see, but you wouldn't see the property tax revenues until you have it.
I'm not concerned about that quite yet, because I anticipate that's going to happen, just like it did in Winlock. in our other areas of UGA, and especially when we start expanding our UGA. But I think at development stage, the requirements that there be access, that there be utility hookups, et cetera, may stop that cold in the water.
But that would.
But it also might
It's some forward
incentives-
thinking.
it might spur some negotiations between family members to sit down at a bargaining table and figure something out.
But
Don't know.
probably not until the development application comes forward. Because until then, they just have to demonstrate that the property can be served by city utilities. In order to make it, they have capacity to serve them basically.
But they would then wouldn't they have to show how they're going to be served?
To some degree, yeah.
I mean, like,
Conceptually,
you're gonna
yeah.
go down First Street, or you're gonna cut across somebody's property, or?
They would have to show through the annexation application. But through a development application, you have to show specifically, you have to demonstrate the ability to serve.
Right, and
So
that's what I'm getting at. It can be stopped cold in the water if they can't provide those.
Yeah, and the annexation may be stopped cold too, if they can't even come up with a concept that provides them with utility and transportation connection. But we haven't even gotten that far yet, we just noticed that, I mean, this is the fatal flaw in itself in the annexation request. And that's the item of the agenda that we're on now is, they talking about the annexation specifically, and I think council kind of flagged it that way too and thought, yeah, this doesn't look approvable, can we have planning commission take a look at it, make a recommendation and send it back to us, but as I said, from my communication with the applicant, she's already voiced an opinion of, if this doesn't look approvable, I'm just gonna withdraw it and save myself any further cost.
Councilman Hayes, you have been the chair before. Were you able to make motions?
Yeah.
Can I make them? I can
I
make
have a
them.
question though.
Yes, sir.
Joel was able to figure that out with the Sorensen properties, right? To make that annexation work. I mean, you don't have a donut hole if they can create this consortium in that corner that wants to annex.
That's true.
And that also fixes their access problem, right? I mean, there's
Well,
a
annexation-
number of landowners that they're gonna need to figure out how to get into that property.
Annexation doesn't fix the access issue.
But part of the whole deal, if they could put something together, because the only access to even is to get back there at all, to get to our red property down at the bottom is through an easement
Yeah, and that's not,
already, and that can't become a street, as far as I know.
and for a subdivision, you'd require a street.
Yeah, so I
And the easement's limited by what the easement says, that's a private agreement, so if the easement allows in more intensified use or not, or, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, sometimes they.
And there was 2 houses put down there the year before last, and that's because they're the easement owners. So
Oh.
that's how that happened, so.
Yeah, and to some degree, access and transportation is an element of annexation, so to some degree, they'd have to demonstrate that.
I don't see it. I don't.
But they can demonstrate that as
I
coming in,
We've already mentioned,
across the property. they don't
I would
have
feel
ability to
comfortable
access
making
that.
a motion
That
that
would
we just
be
reject the
acceptable for
annexation application.
For development application, it would not. You'd be forced to, they'd be forced to demonstrate that they can provide that to the actual development.
So it would be good if the applicant knew that.
Yeah, and I think the applicant's aware,
You feel okay?
I haven't had the access specific
About what?
conversation, but I will.
Feel okay about suggesting
I'll follow
something
up
to
with the
council?
applicant after this
I don't have a problem with
meeting.
Sorry, Steve, I still.
Option 3,
it. Huh?
with option 3.
We've already done that.
Okay.
We already voted on that. Okay. So I would make a motion that we choose to reject the application for annexation at this time, considering the pitfalls that it may incur, and move forward with the ILA as previously motioned. Can I get a second on that?
I will second that motion.
Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
I'm abstaining.
Abstain? Okay, motion carries. Next is Kurt Reddick development request.
Yes, and I did prepare a staff report for that.
Yes, you did.
Essentially, Mr. Reddick has submitted two different applications. One of those is an application for a building permit, which, given my past conversations with Chair Birch, I've discovered that planning commission should be reviewing and approving those before staff signs off on the form and ships it off to the county. So now that I've corrected my procedural error, that one is before you tonight as a building permit request. The building permit request is for a 12-plex. It's on a piece of property zoned for residential. I reviewed it. My staff report includes findings that it does in fact meet all of the required zoning elements, but only if the street vacation is approved. Without the street vacation, which council has not approved yet, then it does not meet the zoning requirements. The lot sizes that are underlying don't support multifamily housing. You've got public right of way that goes through a building and private property, and so at this point in time, you don't have an approvable building permit application in front of you.
But with vacation of the alley, we do.
With vacation of the alley, you do.
Okay.
We haven't addressed that yet.
So the staff recommendation, rather than deny the application for building permit because it doesn't meet current standards and force the applicant to reapply, we were recommending that you just table that. Putting it on the table or delaying a decision on it is just that. Put it aside for a future meeting and then you can pick it back up and figure out what you want to do about it then. So that's the building permit side of things. On the street vacation request,
Well, should we take care of that one right now with a motion to table?
if you'd like, if you want to do them separately or together,
Let's make a motion to table that until such time as it meets all the design criteria. So I'm gonna get a second. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried.
so that one goes to the table. The annexation request or the street vacation request then. I also prepared staff findings on that. The applicants submitted all of the required information and has submitted a supportable request to vacate that alleyway. The applicant owns all sides of the alleyway, so the applicant meets the requirement for having more than 2/3 of the people petitioning for the vacation. Currently, the city doesn't use that alleyway. I've checked with Public Works. There's no city utilities that run through it. There's no city street that is actually existing or paved there. There's no public throughway that is noticeable. It certainly is public property, but it's not used as such. There's nothing there. So it does seem in the applicant and the city's best interest to vacate that property. And so the staff is recommending approval of the street vacation. So with your recommendation to council, then that would go back in front of council at their next meeting and they take action.
Has anybody else had a chance to go through this land appraisal?
Vacation, yes, appraisal, no.
Okay, I have some problems with it. I went on to the county parcel map website. And there are two of their comparables. Comparable number 5 is listed as a 26,250 foot square lot, when in fact the county parcel map shows it as a 7,405 square foot lot. The latest purchase price amount of $74,000 equates to a $10 per square foot price rather than the $451 shown in the appraisal. Comparable number 4 at 335 North 4th Street is shown as a 9,469 square foot lot, when in fact the parcel map on county shows it as a 7,200 square foot lot. And the purchase price of $85,000 under the county's square footage shows a value of $11.81. what I thought was interesting is that the owner recently purchased the 3 of the 4 parcels on the lot in which he desires to develop, and yet they're not part of the comparables. Considering he's looking for a vacancy of the alley on that very same lot, it would seem appropriate that the valuation of that alley be appropriate to what he paid for those other 3 parcels. I have it written down here. That the 3 parcels are in total a purchase price of $254,422. And I believe it was 26,136 square feet total. And that equals an average of $9.73 a square foot, or a total of $17,464. So I would ask that the applicant, well, really has one of several options, come back to planning commission with an appraisal that reflects true market value for those lots and the alley, or some basis for where they arrived at $6,800 as the purchase price or the appraisal price, or agree to the average of the very lots that he's intending to build would be an assessment of $17,464.
So Steve, the applicant said.
Yeah.
And that appraisal was created by a third party appraiser,
I'm familiar with appraisals.
and I didn't create it. And if I looked at these lots, talking about comparing lots that are buildable to lots that are not buildable. You in no way have a lot that is a buildable lot in the way of an alley with the city. You have a lot that's used for municipal egress and whatnot for utilities and potentially some traffic. So you're not comparing apples to apples. I'm not the appraiser, so I'm not defending that. And then if you're talking about what I actually paid for the lots, I actually bought the house and the 2 lots together, and the 3rd lot that was by itself, I paid $25,000 for. I'm not sure where you're looking at for $254,000, but that's not accurate. The price that was paid for those entire property, and it's all lumped into one person, was for the house. And if you look at the valuation of the house itself, you'll find that the total purchase price is fairly close to the valuation of the home. That being said, could you come back and say, well, if you have a buildable lot and it's 9,000 square feet, you see those selling all over Lewis County for anywhere between 50 and 100,000, depending where you're at. That's not an inaccurate statement, but in my opinion, you're not really comparing a buildable lot to what the city owns. Having said that, like.
Well, I realize that we're talking 1,794 square feet of 23,000 square foot parcel.
Right.
Okay, so why would that land be valued at any less than the parcel lands?
It was not buildable.
But without it, you don't build.
That's true, but I'm just saying that the current valuation as it's here.
I mean, you talk about lots with nothing on them. I mean, your comparable number 2 was actually a very difficult lot because I looked at it. I'm sure several others in the community looked at it.
Is it buildable?
Well, if you take out the concrete slabs and you remove some power and things like that,
Is it buildable? Yes or no?
it is
Okay.
8,134 square feet for $100,000.
Right.
Yes, sir.
With all that being said, though, I mean, how much you guys would gain with this building in there, with public works, how much money you guys would get with water and septic and all that?
Well,
But just trying to put in to here, doesn't that?
I'm
in
not,
our city.
yeah, we're not really addressing the development portion of this yet. And,
I was gonna ask,
Wait, you're taking an appraisal and you're saying it's wrong, right?
Okay.
That's your stipulation.
yeah, it looks like he cherry picked it.
what's the actual action we're looking at taking?
Well, we can reject it like I was mentioning doing, or offer him an alternative. Or he can return with an appraisal that appears to be more in line with the actual parcel values.
But isn't he just asking to vacate the alley? Is that?
But he has to pay the city for it. Does he pay him $6,000 or does he pay him $17,000?
Oh, okay, okay.
I
Thank
believe
you,
it's
Steve.
half the
Thank you,
value.
Steve.
I'm sorry?
I believe it says half the value. Is what I have to pay for it. You know,
So the opinion of value is $6,800 and you want to pay $3,400?
saying what I want to pay.
I know you want to pay nothing.
When you're talking about a development to your city that could invigorate the city, you have a beautiful city. You're close to the mountains, you're close to the river. And you don't really have anything new that's being built. And the way I see it is, it's a great place, like, why don't we build stuff that's? being-
I don't
why
disagree, Kurt, at all. I mean, you're developing other lots in the city and I applaud you for doing so. But it's our job to be caretakers for the city's best interest. And by isolating the alley as a sub parcel to 3 parcels that you own that you're going to develop and saying, well, this parcel all by itself isn't worth nearly what the rest of these parcels are.
Yeah.
You know, I've done a lot of land deals and typically that doesn't fly. Because the guy will say, you want a chunk of my land. Even if I've purchased as low as 1,500 square feet, and it was the appraised total of the lot divided by the square footage. And you decide whether you want to do it or you don't want to do it. But I think the appraisal that he came up with here is a little bit out of whack. And his lot sizes are different, so does he need to go back and correct it and come back and discuss it again? Because he made a big issue out of rural versus in-town lots not being worth as much, when in fact he misquoted the square footage on the one lot at 510.
If the appraisal is inaccurate, I can actually agree. But I don't know if it is or not, I didn't make it, I had nothing to do with it, I didn't tell him to do anything.
So Chair Burge, I think
Yes, sir.
that, I think what I mean, to kind of maybe help to summarize. I think what you were suggesting is that you'd like more information on the appraisal. And that, I mean, right now you have an option to recommend to council that they approve it, recommend to council that they deny it, or you could continue your hearing to your next meeting. And then accept additional information to support either the appraisal, or some additional information. We certainly heard some testimony from the applicant tonight too, on why the valuation is what it is. But I think those are from a procedural standpoint, your 3 options are approve, recommend approval, recommend denial, or continue your hearing to a future date and accept additional information. I think those are procedurally the 3. If you make a recommendation to council will then act on it, and they are the decision makers, so they would, you could make a recommendation that council use the appraised value of the property that you have discovered from the recent sales, or the 17,000. You can make a recommendation that includes that to council with a recommendation for approval. You can do the same thing with a recommendation for denial, and then leave council to figure out which way they want to go on it, or you could continue the hearing and accept additional information. So those are kind of procedurally the options that you have.
Yeah,
Can I just talk a little bit now?
sure, go ahead.
I gotta be. We are at a crossroads in America where you can't build anything anymore. And unless the government supports it, you can't afford to build it. So I come in here with something that I believe is good for the community, that will benefit the community, that will benefit Toledo, that will benefit the residents here. And you turn it down because you're not getting enough money. Well, guess what? You're gonna get paid for it. You will get your dues. Over the next 30 years, you'll get paid over and over and over. You're talking about passive income and you're gonna pass it up over that. I mean, that's.
You know, Kurt, I'm sympathetic. I spent 30 years in development. I sat on the other side of the table for so many meetings. I cannot tell you. And. You know, being $200,000 in the hole before a stick goes in the ground is something I'm used to. And you don't like it and you hate it and you don't like the takes and if it pencils out, you still go forward with it. So I am not unsympathetic. And the fact that you are a local builder, the fact you are a local developer means the world to us. Because we know we're gonna get a good product. We're gonna have somebody who's gonna be around here to manage the product as well. All I'm saying is I started going through this appraisal and I've seen a lot of holes in it. And, you know, looking at from my past experience on doing these right-of-way vacations and partial lot purchases, you end up spending a lot more than you think you should, because you end up spending an average of what the whole darn thing costs. I don't disagree that the alley per se by itself, if you were to go out on the alley market, isn't worth $17,000. But it's part of a larger parcel that you want to develop that has a value that's much larger than that. And the city is saying, wait a sec, this is where we're going to get it. We're going to get it on hookups, which goes straight to our community, our development fund for the sewer and water systems. So the city doesn't go out and spend that money. And building permits, if you end up doing your building permits to the city. Other than tax value and sales tax when people Amazon to you, that's pretty much what we're going to see as far as revenue is concerned. And the property tax receipts by the city are pretty minimal. So the city's not going to make a lot of money on this. I'm not sure, quite honestly, if I was a neighbor of this subdivision or of this parcel, that I'd be real keen about having 12 apartments to live right next to me when I've been living in a R1 sort of residential area forever. But we're willing to go through the process, but you have to meet us halfway. And at this particular time, you know, either fix the things in the appraisal and come back with something more sensible, or I would recommend at least tabling it until we get further information.
What do you think is a fair number?
I don't know, you know. If you take it straight average, the fair number is the value of the land. If you take it as a that would be something council would have to determine. And
Well, you're making determinations up there right now on the valuation of the property. You're saying the appraisal is inaccurate. You surely have a fair property value in mind. If it is 1,700 square feet and you value it at $10 a foot, then say that.
$17,000.
I would call it. Okay. So, I mean, is there a way to just say like $10 a foot and do it that way?
Well, it's still 1,794. I mean, if you want to do $10 a square foot, that was my other proposition, was that you accept the valuation we proposed and move forward. We'd recommend approval at that rate and move on to city council.
So procedurally, there has to be some valuation of the property that has to be accepted. It's not a negotiated value. It's not like private development. So you can either choose to rely on the appraisal or an amended appraisal, or you have to rely on the assessed value by the assessor or something else that's documented. It's the reason that you don't negotiate the values of these things is because the government is effectively surplusing the property. When you're saying that you agree to the vacation, you're agreeing it's not of use to the city. And I did not bring the state law with me on that, but in all the street vacations I've done, it's very clear in there that the value has to be set as a fair market valuation. It's, I guess if you were to agree on a value with the applicant, then that could be the fair market valuation because it's an open market. Maybe we can do a staff report as long as nobody challenged it. But if somebody were to challenge that, we were to try to demonstrate how we came up with the fair market valuation, to rely on anything less than something that's documented by an appraiser or an assessor or a recent sale or something like that. You don't really have the latitude to negotiate a price, is what I'm suggesting. Now, council can make a finding that, that based on the valuation of the property, that these things reduce the factors and that they're going to accept less. But again, it's not negotiated, it's still based on the fair market value, and it has to be that way. People don't negotiate by right away from the government. That's.
How do you take a fair market value of alleys? You go around and look at all the alleys that you sold.
Well, I mean, typically, that's why they require the appraisal. In this case, it sounds like planning commission has issues with the appraisal. And I think one of the options that you have is you can get your appraiser to further demonstrate why that appraisal is accurate. And then say that's what it is. I mean, certainly I've heard what you said tonight and that's believable, but it's not something that can be negotiated is what I'm saying. You have to go with one value or the other. It has to be documented somewhere in order for council to accept it. Your appraisal could be accepted, but it looks like planning commission is not willing to accept it. So you can't really, it's not a negotiation is what I'm saying.
Well,
It
Cindy.
just has to be based on the fair market value.
help the appraiser down.
I've tried that once, it didn't work.
Well, but you can certainly make a recommendation to council, with the valuation based on the recent sale that you observed. And then in that time, since you're making a recommendation, council's got to have a public hearing on it anyway. The applicant will have a chance to testify. So you can forward your recommendation with the value of 17,000 that you believe to be the fair market value of the property. And then council can make a decision.
Well, let them be the bad guy, because I don't like being the bad guy.
Well, it's not you, it's planning commission. All of the commissioners have to agree on the motion. You're the chair and certainly you have authority, but that's the other thing is the applicant also has the ability to submit additional information before council hears it too, so.
Well, I'd like to see Kurt go ahead with his development. I think it's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, yes, I want to see that, the city gets reasonable compensation.
And is it important that planning commission review that again? Or are you comfortable making a recommendation to planning commission, or making a recommendation to council? Without seeing what the actual number is? Is the number important to planning commission?
It is.
Or is just the
Fairness.
difference?
I think that we
Is
ought
important.
to give the council all the information
Certainly they'll have. the full
and
record.
say we recommend approval of the vacation on its merits. We have a difference in what we believe the land is worth. And it's based on the appraisal versus fair market sales,
And who ultimately makes
city council.
that appraisal?
Council makes the decision, but they too can't negotiate it. They have to make it based on a fair market value that's established through either an appraisal or an assessed value or something. So they can make adjustments to that based on elements that aren't reflected in the appraisal. Or the fair market.
Who makes the appraisal?
The appraisers. Those appraisers are certified by the state. The appraisal that you have in front of you is by a certified third-party appraiser.
With the certificate on the back.
In your procedural requirements, either the applicant can pay that or the city can pay it. But either way, it has to be one of the certified appraisers from the state's registered list.
Sure.
So it's
So
not
what
like
we-
the applicant went out and just found a buddy to appraise the property.
Well, I hope not.
They're all on a state list and they all have codes of ethics and they're held with the standard of an appraiser, so they usually have merit, but they do make mistakes and there will be no way for me as your city planner to know. That's why the code says that you have to do it based on a fair market value established either by appraisal or you can use tax assessment data or which is what recent sales are. I mean, that's what you're going off of.
So we could propose that council looks at it with a note from either the appraiser saying why the appraisal is at that value and or a modification of said appraisal.
And correct, if these are indeed errors in the square footage and
Right.
I'm looking at the county parcel maps.
Mhm.
If if you make a recommendation for approval or denial, this goes to council. If in that recommendation, you can say, we don't believe that the valuation is set accurately, then council would be in the same spot that you are now. They'd be forced to either make a decision based on the facts they had. But if you want more information on this before you make the recommendation, then you have to continue it and ask the applicant to provide that to you. Council can do the same when it gets to them. They can accept one of these values, or they can also continue it and ask the applicant for more information.
I don't like holding him up. I mean, you know, we're talking. 12 unit apartment complex, his loan's gonna be probably in the $1 million range, and we were talking about $10,000 difference. I do not wish to hold him up from developing simply because of this issue. But the issue does need to be addressed, so I would make a motion that we move with the process forward to city council. That we believe that the appraisal is under fair market value. And that their assessment should be based on recent sales.
That sounds like a motion.
I'll second it.
No, it's
Any
to
more
vacate Valley, correct?
That was motion to approve
With the fair
vacation
market value, got it,
with the adjustment, the fair market value is.
got it.
Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries.
Yes or not?
Yes, sir.
Where is that property?
Fifth and Maple,
It's the alley between.
Park corner. Talk to the park. There's one house on the northeast corner. And then 3 vacant parcels, actually.
Next to the mayor?
No,
No.
way down.
Across from the park, Joe.
Right next to the park.
Hey, Kurt, I
I'll
had one question for you. One of the comps they used here were on Silver Street, which you're the owner of.
Silver Street.
I think it was 410.
Yeah, that one,
Where in the hell is that on that?
right up there.
I mean, I know where it's at there, but the way it showed on the county's parcel map, it looked like it was curmudgeoned in between two other parcels. And they have it listed at 7,200 square feet,
5,000 square feet. Talking about 211 Silver Street?
335 North Floor, if I'm sorry.
I just measured the alley, it's exactly 1,700 square feet, it's 15 by 145.
Oh, you're talking about your property over here on Fifth.
Yeah, this alley that you're talking about, so that's square footage on, it's right. Whatever,
211 Silver
211
Street is the
Silver
one I'm
Street.
thinking, yeah, 4,900 square feet.
yes. And that thing didn't have any access, I had to put 300 feet of forced main sewer to the manhole. And 300 feet back to the valve. On First Street. So. I mean, half the time I'm not even sure if I wanna build it. Did you see what it is that I'm trying to build?
Yes,
Okay, that's it. Of
I'm not sure I'd like to live near you, but I like the concept.
course, why don't you wanna live in there if you have enough money not to? But if you're talking about affordable housing, right? It's not gonna-
Are we talking affordable housing?
It depends what you call it, affordable. We put double wides out there.
It's not subsidized affordable housing.
We put tiny homes out there. And
You could do that. You could do that. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
I think that covers all the business we have.
That was everything I had on your agenda. Mr.
Any public comment? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
I will second it.
all in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Adjourns.